My name is Ryan, and for 13 years I believed that if you loved someone enough and worked hard enough, the rest of it took care of itself. I want to tell you about the Tuesday everything started coming apart, except it didn't feel like anything at the time. That's the part nobody warns you about. The worst days of your life rarely announce themselves. They dress up as ordinary ones. It was 6:40 in the evening, mid-August, and Natalie was standing at the front door of our house on Linden Court with her keys already in her hand, a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, a folder of what she called practice sheets tucked under her arm. She kissed me goodbye the way she always did. Quick, on the corner of my mouth, half turned toward the driveway before her lips even landed, and said the same 6 words she'd been saying every Tuesday and Thursday for months. "Tutoring's running late again, babe." I said okay. I said drive safe. I went back to loading the dishwasher because Caleb had left his cereal bowl crusted on the counter again, and some part of me needed that small, contained irritation more than I needed to look up and actually see my wife's face. I was 41 years old, 12 years into a career that had eaten every extra hour I had to give it, and I had gotten very good at not looking up. That's not a confession I'm proud of. It's just the truth, and if I don't tell you that part first, none of the rest of this will make sense. Natalie was 37. We'd met when she was an ICU nurse, and I was a med device rep cold calling her floor with samples nobody asked for. And somehow that turned into 13 years, a house with a crooked mailbox post, 2 kids, and a marriage that from the outside looked like it was doing just fine. She'd stepped back from the ICU 6 years earlier, after Lily was born, and taken a quieter job scheduling appointments at a pediatric clinic across town. She never complained about it out loud. I noticed, in the vague way you notice weather changing, that she'd gotten quieter in general. I told myself that was just what happened to people in their late 30s. I told myself a lot of things instead of asking her directly. The tutoring had started in April. Natalie's father, Hector, had died 2 years before that. A heart attack in his garage back in Peoria, gone before the ambulance even arrived. And something about his death had opened a door in her that I didn't fully understand and, if I'm honest, didn't try hard enough to walk through with her. Hector had come up from Zacatecas in his 20s and never taught Natalie more than a handful of Spanish words, always promising there'd be time later. There wasn't. After he died, Natalie decided, almost out of nowhere one Sunday morning over coffee, that she was going to learn the language he'd never given her. She signed up for an adult enrichment class at the Rockford Community Learning Center, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7 to 9, taught by a man named Marco Torres. I thought it was one of the better things to come out of her grief. I told her that, and I meant it. I have to be honest about that too, because it matters later. I was glad. I was glad she had something. I was glad it wasn't me she needed to lean on, because I didn't have the hours to give her anyway, and some quiet, ugly part of me was relieved that her grief had found somewhere else to go besides my inbox of unanswered texts and missed dinners. That August evening, after she left, I finished the dishes, helped Caleb with a fractions worksheet he clearly hadn't started until I walked in, and put Lily to bed with the same picture book we'd read 40 times because she liked the illustrations more than the story. Around 9:30, Natalie's car pulled into the driveway. She came in smelling faintly of coffee and something else underneath it, something warm and slightly spiced that wasn't her usual soap, and she dropped her folder on the kitchen table and said the class had run long because they were reviewing for a placement thing. I said that sounded good. I asked if she was hungry. She said she'd grabbed something on the way. Here's the detail I want you to hold on to, because I didn't hold on to it myself for a long time. Her phone, which had sat face up on the kitchen counter every evening for 6 years, had started coming home face down, tucked into the outside pocket of her tote instead of her purse. I registered it the way you register a picture frame hanging half an inch off center. A fact without weight, filed away instead of examined. That night, I went to bed thinking about a client presentation in Peoria the next morning. I did not think about my wife's phone. That's the man I was that Tuesday in August, and I want you to remember him, because by the time this story ends, he won't exist anymore, and I'm still not entirely sure whether that's a loss or the only good thing that came out of any of it. We build a life the way most people do, in installments, one ordinary decision at a time, none of them seeming to matter much on their own. We bought the house on Linden Court the year Caleb turned 3 because the school district was good and the yard had a maple tree we thought the kids would climb someday. Natalie hung curtains she'd sewn herself in the kitchen. I built a bookshelf that came out slightly crooked, and we never fixed it, because fixing it felt like admitting it bothered us. Little imperfections you decide not to look at too closely. I understand now that I'd been doing that with more than furniture. If you've ever looked at your own life and thought, this is fine, we're fine, without ever actually checking, you'll understand why I didn't ask more questions that August. Some of us build whole marriages on the difference between fine and actually fine, and don't find out which one we had until it's too late to matter. The next morning, I drove Caleb to school and caught myself glancing at the passenger seat. At the spot where Natalie's tote bag usually sat on the mornings, she dropped the kids off before her shift. It wasn't there. She'd left early. A prep meeting at the clinic, she'd said the night before, something about the fall vaccination schedule. I didn't question it. Why would I have? She'd never given me a reason to build a case against her, and I wasn't the kind of man who went looking for one. I was the kind of man who assumed that if something was wrong, someone would tell me. It took me a long time to understand that assumption is its own kind of arrogance. The belief that the people you love will always find the energy to fight through your inattention and reach you anyway. At work that day, I closed a deal on a new ultrasound console for a clinic in Belvedere, and I remember feeling that particular satisfaction of a good number landing in the right column, a feeling that used to be enough to carry me home. I called Natalie on my drive back, mostly out of habit. She didn't pick up. She texted 20 minutes later, "Sorry, in a meeting, everything okay?" And I said everything was fine, because everything was, as far as I knew. That was the shape of our marriage by then. Two people orbiting the same house, occasionally touching, mostly just passing close enough to feel each other's warmth without ever quite landing. I want to say I noticed the distance and did nothing because I was afraid of what closing it might cost me. That would make me sound thoughtful, even tragic. The truth is smaller and less flattering. I didn't notice the distance at all. I thought we were exactly where we'd always been. I would find out in September how wrong that was, and it would come from a direction I never once considered. Not a suspicion, not a hunch, not some tightening in my gut that told me something was off. It would come from a birthday gift I hadn't even finished planning yet, and a phone call I made purely because I wanted, for once, to surprise my wife with something that meant something to her. August folded into itself the way it always does in Rockford. Humid mornings, the lawn going a little brown at the edges, Caleb starting 7th grade with the particular dread of a kid who'd rather be anywhere but a classroom, Lily counting down to her school's fall carnival with the single-minded devotion only an 8-year-old can manage. Natalie kept going to her Tuesday and Thursday classes. I kept working late 3 or 4 nights a week, telling myself the extra hours were for us, for the kids, for the house with the crooked bookshelf and the mortgage that never quite felt paid down enough. Looking back now, I can see how easily two people can build entirely separate lives inside the same 4 walls without either one of them noticing the walls going up. At the time, none of it registered as separation. It registered as normal. That's the thing about a marriage running on autopilot. The autopilot feels, for a long while, indistinguishable from the real thing. Natalie started leaving her phone in the car more often. She said the charger in the kitchen had stopped working right, that it drained faster than it charged, and I believed her because I had no reason not to, and because I genuinely hadn't checked the charger myself. She began doing her makeup differently on tutoring nights. Not more, exactly, just different, a shade of lipstick I didn't recognize showing up in her bag, a scent of something floral and unfamiliar clinging to the scarf she started wearing even though it was 90 degrees outside. I noticed the scarf. I thought, that's new. I did not think, why? If you've ever caught yourself explaining away a small thing because the alternative explanation was too heavy to carry into a Tuesday evening, you already understand what I did with that scarf, and with the lipstick, and with a dozen other small facts I filed under nothing, because filing them under anything else would have required me to actually look at my wife and ask her a question I wasn't ready to hear the answer to. One Thursday in early September, I picked Lily up from a friend's birthday party and swung by the pediatric clinic to grab Natalie's badge, which she'd forgotten that morning. The front desk woman, Denise, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses always pushed up into gray hair, mentioned in passing that Natalie had left a little early that day, around 3, for what Denise assumed was a doctor's appointment. Natalie's actual shift ran until 5. I didn't ask Denise anything further. I told myself Natalie had probably swapped shifts and forgotten to mention it, which was true often enough that the excuse cost me nothing to believe. That evening, Natalie came home a little after 9, same as always, and told me the class had covered subjunctive verb tenses, which she found brutal, and asked if I'd started the load of laundry she'd left in the dryer. I had not. We had a small, familiar argument about laundry that dissolved into nothing within 5 minutes. The kind of argument that exists mostly to prove two people are still capable of arguing, still occupying the same emotional room, even when they're not really looking at each other. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the moment I think about most when people ask me how I missed it. It wasn't one enormous lie. It was never one enormous lie. It was 100 small, plausible half-truths, each one reasonable on its own, each one small enough to swallow without choking. If you've ever wondered how a person misses something that seems, in hindsight, impossible to miss, this is how. Not through stupidity, through 1,000 individually forgivable moments that only add up to something monstrous when you finally stack them side by side. Around this time, I noticed something else, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. Natalie had started a habit of glancing at her phone the instant it buzzed, then setting it face down again almost too quickly, a motion so fast it barely registered as emotion at all. When I asked, once, half joking, who kept texting her so much, she said it was her sister Elena, going through a divorce and needing someone to vent to. I believed her, because Elena actually was going through a divorce, and because the lie fit so neatly into a truth already sitting in plain view that I never thought to look underneath it. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes from loving someone for a long time. You stop seeing the person fresh and start seeing the story you've already written about them. I had written Natalie as steady, devoted, incapable of the kind of deception that would blow a hole in our life. I wasn't wrong about who she'd been for most of our marriage. I was wrong about assuming a person can't change shape quietly, in the dark, while you're busy assuming they're standing exactly where you left them. Something shifted in me that week, though I couldn't have named it then. A low hum of unease, not quite suspicion, more like the feeling of a room slightly colder than it should be. I remember standing in the kitchen one night, watching Natalie laugh at something on her phone, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she used to save for me, and feeling a flicker of something I didn't have a word for yet. I told myself it was probably Elena's divorce drama. I went back to unloading the dishwasher. Caleb, meanwhile, had started asking why Mom was always tired on Wednesdays. I told him grown-ups get tired sometimes. He accepted that the way kids accept most adult explanations, with a shrug and a return to his video game. But I noted, distantly, that he'd noticed something too. Children see more than we credit them for. They just don't yet have language for what they're seeing, so it comes out sideways, in offhand questions that adults are too distracted to sit with. By mid-September, the scarf had become a fixture on tutoring nights. The phone habit had sharpened into something almost ritualistic, and I had begun, without consciously deciding to, building a small, uneasy catalog of details I couldn't quite explain and didn't quite want to. I want to be honest about something here. Some part of me had already started noticing that the woman coming home from tutoring seemed lighter, more alive, more herself than the woman who kissed me goodbye at the door. I noticed it the way you notice a bruise days after the impact, a discoloration you can't quite trace back to its cause, and don't try very hard to. If I'd been paying real attention, I might have asked myself the obvious question sooner. Why did learning Spanish seem to be doing more for my wife's spirit than 13 years of marriage to me? I didn't ask it. I filed that feeling away too, next to the scarf, next to the lipstick, next to the phone turned face down a half-second too fast, and I went on believing that ordinary was the same thing as fine. It was Natalie's 38th birthday coming up at the end of September that finally moved me to do something different, not because I suspected anything, but because I wanted, for once, to give her something that mattered more than the usual Bocan dinner routine I'd been running for years out of habit rather than imagination. I decided I would call the Rockford Community Learning Center and prepay for the advanced Spanish course, the one that would follow her current class into the winter session. I imagined her opening the envelope and being surprised that I'd actually paid attention to something she cared about. I liked the idea. I liked, for once, feeling like a husband who noticed things. I had no idea that phone call would be the moment the entire architecture of my life quietly began to fail. I made the call on a Wednesday afternoon, from my car in the parking lot of a clinic in Freeport where I'd just finished a sales visit, Because I wanted to catch the community center before it closed for the day. A woman answered, brisk, businesslike, the kind of voice that's fielded 1,000 scheduling questions and doesn't waste syllables. I explained what I wanted: to enroll my wife, Natalie Callahan, in the winter advanced Spanish course as a birthday surprise, and to ask when registration opened. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that means someone is pulling up a screen and not finding what they expect. "I'm sorry," she said. "We don't have a Spanish program running this fall. We haven't since spring." I told her that couldn't be right. My wife had been attending Tuesday and Thursday evening sessions since April. "Let me check something," she said, and I heard keys clicking. We did have a Tuesday through Thursday adult Spanish class in the spring block, April through early June, taught by Marco Torres. It ran 8 sessions, and then it was discontinued. Low enrollment. I think we only had 2 or 3 people signed up by the end. Mr. Torres actually left the program in June. I don't have any record of a fall continuation. We haven't offered evening Spanish since. I sat in my car with the engine running and the AC blowing directly into my face, and for several seconds I genuinely could not process what she'd said. The way your mind sometimes refuses new information, not because it doesn't understand it, but because understanding it means everything downstream of that sentence has to change too. I asked if there was maybe a different location, a satellite program, something I was missing. She said, not unkindly, that Rockford Community Learning Center was the only public adult ed program in the area, and no, there was nothing else running Tuesday through Thursday evenings that matched what I was describing. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in that parking lot for what felt like a very long time. I want to be honest with you about the first thing I felt, because it wasn't rage and it wasn't grief. It was a strange, floating disorientation, like the ground under a familiar room had been quietly swapped out while I wasn't looking, and now I was standing on something that only resembled solid. I ran through excuses on Natalie's behalf before I'd even started the car. Maybe she'd switched to a private tutor and hadn't mentioned it. Maybe there was a mix-up with the name. Maybe the woman I'd spoken to was simply wrong. I wanted, desperately, for there to be an explanation that didn't require me to rebuild everything I thought I knew. That night, when Natalie asked what was wrong, because apparently something in my face gave me away, even though I said nothing, I told her I was just tired from the drive. I didn't ask her about the class. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters. I had proof, real proof, that something didn't add up, and my first instinct wasn't to confront her. It was to protect the version of my marriage I still needed to believe in for one more night. I understand now that this wasn't patience. It was fear dressed up as patience, and it cost me nearly 3 more weeks of a truth I could have had immediately, if I'd only been brave enough to ask a direct question at a direct moment. I called the community center back 2 days later from a different number and asked to speak with whoever had taught the Spanish class in the spring, explaining I was trying to track down some old class materials. They gave me an email from Marco Torres, no longer affiliated with the program, forwarding requests to a personal address. I didn't email him. Not yet. I wasn't ready for what an answer from him might contain. She told me, much later, what was happening on her end that same week, something I didn't know at the time and only pieced together after everything came apart. I remember sitting in my car outside the coffee shop on Kilburn, watching the clock, telling myself this was the last Tuesday. I told myself that every week since May, and every week I found a reason it couldn't be the last one yet. His hand on my back walking me out. The way he actually asked how I was doing and waited for the real answer. The way grief had made me feel invisible to everyone except him. That week, I remember thinking Ryan looked at me strangely at dinner, and my whole body went cold for a second before I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself, he doesn't check. He's never checked. I believed that right up until I didn't. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Instead of confronting her, I began, quietly, methodically, in a way that shamed me even as I did it, tracking small things. I checked our joint credit card statement online and found a recurring charge at a place called the Ashcroft, a boutique hotel about 20 minutes from the community center, dated on Tuesdays and Thursdays going back to May. I found a smaller, separate charge at a florist I didn't recognize, dated the week before, $34.50, no note. I told myself, even as I compiled this, that I was looking for an explanation that would clear her. That was another lie I told myself, and it was easier to tell than most, because it let me keep gathering evidence without admitting I already believed what the evidence was going to say. Around this time, Natalie's sister Elena called our landline by mistake, looking for Natalie, and mentioned, offhand, thinking I already knew, that Natalie had told her she'd quit the Spanish thing weeks ago, too busy. I said nothing to correct her. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the crooked bookshelf I'd never bothered to fix, thinking about how much easier it is to live with a small imperfection than to tear the whole thing down and build it straight. I called in sick to work the following Tuesday, the first time I'd done that in 6 years, and instead of going to the office, I drove to the Ashcroft and parked across the street, in the lot of a shuttered furniture store, and waited. I told myself I was doing due diligence. What I was actually doing was standing at the edge of a cliff, watching my own feet, trying to decide whether the fall would hurt more than staying up there not knowing. At 7:22 that evening, Natalie's car pulled into the hotel side lot. She sat inside it for almost 4 minutes without moving before she got out, smoothed her skirt, and walked in through the side entrance, the one without a front desk sightline, the one you'd only know to use if you'd used it enough times to learn its rhythms. 11 minutes later, a man I didn't recognize, dark hair, a leather jacket despite the September heat, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who wasn't afraid of being seen, walked in through the same door. I sat in my car for another 40 minutes after that. I did not go inside. I did not call her name across a hotel lobby like some man in a movie who's finally found his nerve. I drove home, picked Caleb up from soccer practice like it was any other Tuesday, and helped him with his homework at the kitchen table while some part of me sat very still in a hotel parking lot 20 minutes away, refusing to move, refusing to believe what my own eyes had already confirmed. That was the moment the story stopped being about tutoring. I understood, sitting there with Caleb's math book open in front of me and my hands perfectly steady, that I already knew almost everything I needed to know. What I didn't have yet was her voice admitting it, and some stubborn, wounded part of me had decided I wasn't going to move another inch until I had that too. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, not because of what I discovered, but because of who I had to become to discover it. I started keeping a small notebook in my glove box, logging dates, times, license plates. I photographed the credit card statements before Natalie could see them on the shared account app. I drove past the Ashcroft twice more, both times confirming what I already knew, both times leaving before I let myself be seen. If you've ever spent 2 weeks living a double life inside your own marriage, smiling at breakfast, packing lunches, asking about your wife's day while a folder of evidence sat locked in your car, you know there's a particular kind of exhaustion in it that has nothing to do with sleep. Natalie noticed something. Of course she did. I wasn't as composed as I wanted to believe I was. She asked, twice, if something was wrong at work. I said the Belvedere account was giving me trouble. It wasn't. That was the first real lie I told her in 13 years, and I remember being almost surprised at how easily it came, how smoothly a person can learn a skill they never wanted to need. I want to name something here, because it's a red flag I completely missed until I went back through it later. Natalie had started coming home from tutoring with her hair slightly damp, twice in 1 month. Something she explained away as the AC in the classroom being broken made me sweat through the walk to the car. I remember thinking, vaguely, that seemed like a lot of sweat for a classroom walk. I didn't push it. Looking back now, that was exactly the kind of detail I should have asked about directly instead of accepting on the surface. Not because a damp collar proves anything on its own, but because I'd stopped asking questions about anything, and a marriage where nobody asks questions is a marriage where anything can grow unnoticed. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the heaviest part of these 2 weeks, and I don't think I've said this out loud to anyone before. There was a night, about 10 days before everything broke open, when I sat on the edge of our bed after Natalie had fallen asleep, and I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, and felt something close to tenderness, even knowing what I knew. Some of you have been here too, I think. That strange, useless love that doesn't switch off just because it should. I didn't wake her up. I didn't say anything. I just sat there in the dark, holding something that was about to change everything, not ready yet to put it down. I found the receipt that finally organized every loose thread into a single narrative on a Thursday, tucked into a jacket Natalie had left over the back of a kitchen chair instead of hanging in the closet. A small, easily missed carelessness that told me, more than anything else, how far she'd drifted from her own caution. It was from the Ashcroft, dated that same afternoon, a room charge for $189, and beneath it, handwritten on the back in a masculine scrawl I didn't recognize, for words. Same time next week? I understood, holding that receipt, that whatever this was, it wasn't a single lapse or a single afternoon of weakness. It had a rhythm. It had a next week built into it, an expectation of continuation, which meant it had been running on its own private schedule for months, parallel to the schedule of our actual marriage, the one with soccer practice and fraction worksheets, and a birthday I'd been trying to plan a surprise for. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through, in her own words, when I asked her about it much later. That receipt. I remember the second I realized I'd left it in my jacket instead of my purse. My stomach dropped in a way it hadn't in months. I almost called him to say we needed to stop, that it had gotten careless, that I was scared. I sat in the clinic parking lot on my break with the phone in my hand and didn't dial. Some part of me, I can admit this now, didn't want to stop. I wanted, for just a little longer, to be the version of myself that existed only in that hotel room. The one who felt seen instead of managed, wanted instead of scheduled around. I told myself Ryan hadn't noticed anything, that he never noticed anything anymore, and that thought should have scared me more than it did. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, though I had the receipt in my hand within the hour. I identified Marco Torres formally 2 days later, through a public staff photo still archived on an old community center newsletter I found by searching his name. The same dark hair, the same build I'd watched cross that hotel parking lot. I want to tell you that finding his name and his face gave me some kind of closure. It didn't. It made the whole thing worse, in a way I hadn't anticipated, because now it wasn't an abstraction. It was a specific man, with a specific face, who had apparently understood something about my wife's grief that I, her husband of 13 years, had failed to reach. I called him. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I wanted to hear a voice attach itself to the handwriting on that receipt. Maybe some part of me still hoped he'd say something that would make this all make sense in a way that didn't destroy everything. He answered on the second ring, sounding wary the moment I gave him my name. I asked him, flatly, if he knew my wife. There was a long silence, and then he said, quietly, "I think you should talk to Natalie," and hung up before I could say anything else. That silence told me more than a confession would have. A man with nothing to hide doesn't hang up on a stranger's first question. By the time I'd gathered everything, the credit card records spanning 5 months, the hotel timestamps, the receipt with its 4 handwritten words, the confirmation that the class she claimed to attend had ceased to exist since June, I had built, without ever meaning to become the kind of man who builds such things, a case. A methodical, dated, cross-referenced case against my own marriage. I laid it all out on the kitchen table late one night after the kids were asleep, and I looked at it the way I might have looked at a competitor's sales figures at work. Clean, factual, impossible to argue with. And I understood that whatever I did next, I would be doing it from a position of complete certainty, which is a colder and lonelier place to stand than suspicion ever was. I chose the following Saturday to confront her, once both kids were at a sleepover across town. I didn't tell her what was coming. I wanted, for once in this entire ordeal, to be the one who controlled the moment instead of the one absorbing it. I laid the folder on the kitchen table before Natalie had even taken her coat off, and I watched her face when she saw it. Not confusion exactly, but a kind of recognition arriving a half-second before she could stop it from showing. I called the community center in September, I said, keeping my voice level, because I had promised myself I would not shout, would not become a man I didn't recognize in front of my own kitchen cabinets. There's no Spanish class. There hasn't been one since June. She sat down slowly across from me, her coat still half on one shoulder, and said, "It's not what you think." I placed the credit card statement in front of her, 5 months of Tuesday and Thursday charges at the Ashcroft, dated and highlighted. "This is exactly what I think," I said. I placed the receipt next to it, the one with the handwritten note. "Same time next week." "Whose handwriting is that, Natalie?" She looked at it for a long moment and said the class had actually continued informally, that Marco had offered free private lessons after the official one ended because enrollment had dropped, that it was just easier to meet at a hotel lobby near his place because his apartment was being renovated. Each sentence came out a little too fast, a little too smoothly assembled for something she claimed was so ordinary. A hotel room, Natalie. Not a lobby. I placed the room charge in front of her. $189. For a language lesson. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said it wasn't serious, that it had started as something small and gotten complicated, that nothing physical had happened until much later than I probably assumed, that I was misreading the timeline. I placed another statement in front of her, May, for months before the later than I assumed she was describing. She looked at it and shifted again, said that even if something had happened, it hadn't meant what I thought it meant, that she'd been drowning since her father died and I hadn't been there, that this wasn't really about Marco at all, not really, if I actually thought about it honestly. I sat across from her, laying out item after item, the receipt, the statements, the archived staff photo, the phone call where Marco had told me to talk to her instead of denying anything. And each time, she took the new fact and folded it into a slightly smaller version of the truth, a version that kept shrinking to fit whatever room I'd just backed her into. It wasn't an affair, then it wasn't serious, then it wasn't really about him, then it wasn't entirely her fault. She never once said the word cheating. She never once looked at me and simply said, "Yes, I did this, and I'm sorry." There's a particular kind of devastation in watching someone you love try to negotiate the size of their own betrayal in real time, item by item, like a lawyer working down a sentence. I felt something in me go very quiet and very still, not calm, exactly, but a kind of stillness that comes from finally standing on solid ground after weeks of not knowing where the floor was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every time she reframed something, I simply placed the next piece of evidence in front of her until there was nothing left on the table that hadn't already been placed, and nothing left in her explanations that hadn't already been contradicted by something she'd said 3 sentences earlier. I understood, watching her, something I hadn't let myself see clearly until that exact moment. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside. And somewhere in all that peacekeeping, I had stopped being someone she felt she could actually turn to. That didn't make what she did acceptable. It never would. But it explained something about the shape of the hole she'd gone looking to fill, and I owed myself the honesty of seeing that, even in the middle of the worst night of my marriage. "How long?" I finally asked. "Since June? Or since April?" She said it had really started in June, after the class officially ended, as if the earlier weeks somehow didn't count because they technically still involved a lesson plan. I didn't argue the point. I had run out of energy to correct every small reframing, and some part of me understood that arguing over the exact starting line of a betrayal was its own kind of trap. One more way of letting her control the pacing of a conversation I had already spent 2 weeks preparing to control myself. I told her I needed her to leave for the night. Not forever. I wasn't ready to say forever, not with that word sitting in my mouth for the first time, but I needed the house and the silence in it, without her in the middle of that silence making it worse. She asked where I expected her to go. I said I didn't know and I didn't particularly care, which was cruel, and I said it anyway, because for the first time in months I wasn't managing anyone's feelings but my own. She packed a bag with shaking hands and left for her sister Elena's, and I sat at that kitchen table for almost 2 hours after the door closed, looking at the evidence spread out in front of me, feeling something I can only describe as grief arriving early, grieving a marriage that technically hadn't ended yet, but that I already understood, somewhere underneath the shock, was never going to look the way it had looked before that Saturday night. That was the moment I recognized, with a clarity that had been missing from every other part of this, exactly what had happened between us over the past 2 years. Not one betrayal. A slow accumulation of 2 people quietly stopping the work of staying married, until the only thing left holding us together was habit, and habit is not the same thing as love, no matter how convincingly it can imitate it from the outside. Natalie stayed at Elena's for 11 days. She called every evening, and for the first 4 or 5 of those calls, I could hear her still trying to manage the story, softer language, careful phrasing, small attempts to narrow what had happened back down to something survivable. I stopped answering some of those calls, not out of cruelty, because I needed to hear, eventually, the version of the truth that wasn't shaped for my comfort, and I understood she wasn't going to give me that version while she was still afraid of losing everything. She finally gave it to me on a Thursday night, on our back porch, after asking if she could come by to talk without the kids around. I said yes. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because some part of 13 years doesn't dissolve just because it should. Maybe because I understood by then that whatever came next, divorce or something smaller, I needed to hear the whole thing at least once, spoken plainly, before I could decide what to do with the rest of my life. She sat across from me in the porch light and said, "I want to tell you the real version. All of it. You deserve that." She finally spoke. This is what she told me, in her own words, that night. It started the third week of the class, in April. Marco asked how I was doing after a lesson, not the polite kind of asking, the real kind. And I just started crying, right there at a folding table with a Spanish workbook open in front of me. Nobody had asked me that since my father died and actually waited for the answer. I told myself it was nothing, that being noticed by a stranger didn't mean anything. That was the first lie I told myself, and it was the easiest one, because it felt so small. By June, when the class ended and he offered to keep tutoring me privately, I already knew what I was really saying yes to. I told myself it was still about the language, about Hector, about honoring him. I wasn't honoring him. I was hiding behind him. The first time we went to the hotel, I told myself it was the only time, that I'd stop before it became something I couldn't undo. I kept telling myself that every single week, and every week I found a new reason it couldn't be the last one yet. I was terrified of you finding out, but underneath that fear was something worse. I was terrified of going back to feeling invisible, and some part of me decided being invisible was worse than being caught. The night I found the note he'd written on the receipt, I panicked. I almost ended it right there. I couldn't look at Caleb's drawings on the fridge that whole week without feeling sick. But I went back the next Tuesday anyway, because stopping meant admitting what I'd already become, and I wasn't ready to be that person yet. I'm not telling you this to make it smaller. I'm telling you because you deserve the actual shape of it, not the version I kept trying to give you at the kitchen table. That's what she told me. I finally had the whole shape of it, months after I'd started needing it. I didn't say much that night. I told her I appreciated her finally saying it plainly, and that I needed more time before I could tell her what I wanted next. She nodded and left, and didn't call the following night, which I understood as its own kind of respect. 3 weeks later, she asked to come home, not to move back in, just to talk, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd laid out the evidence. She said she'd started seeing a grief counselor on her own for the first time since her father died, and that she understood now the affair had never really been about Marco Torres at all. She asked if there was any chance, over time, of finding our way back to something. I told her I'd thought about that question more than any other question in my life, and the answer I'd arrived at was no, not out of anger anymore, because most of the anger had burned itself down to something quieter by then, but because I'd finally understood something about myself in the process of losing her. I had spent 13 years mistaking peace for partnership, and I didn't want to build whatever came next on that same quiet mistake. I told her I hoped she found what she was looking for, genuinely, and that I would always be Caleb and Lily's father, working alongside her for their sake, but that the door on the two of us was closed, and I needed her to hear that clearly, without softening it for either of our comfort. She cried, and I let her, and I didn't reach across the table the way I might have 3 months earlier. Some doors, once you understand what they actually cost to open, are better left closed than reopened out of habit or guilt or the simple exhaustion of grieving something twice. The cruelest detail in this whole story isn't the hotel receipts or the handwritten note. It's that Natalie's affair began with something almost innocent, a woman grieving her father, wanting to learn the language he never taught her, sitting across from a man who simply asked how she was doing and waited for a real answer. Betrayal rarely starts as betrayal. It starts as a small, human need finding the wrong door to walk through, because the right door, the one marked husband, had quietly stopped opening years before anyone noticed it was shut. That doesn't excuse what she did. It explains it, and explanation and excuse are not the same thing. Even though they can feel identical in the moment, you're the one trying to survive the pain of learning them apart. What this story revealed to me, over time, wasn't really about Natalie at all. It was about the particular kind of marriage two competent, well-meaning people can build entirely on autopilot, mistaking the absence of conflict for the presence of connection. I had spent years congratulating myself on being a good provider, a present father, A man who didn't yell or drink or disappear. And I never once asked myself whether being none of those things was the same as being actually there. It isn't. Natalie's grief needed a witness, and I was too busy being reliable to notice she'd stopped believing I could be that witness for her. The accidental way I learned the truth. A birthday phone call, of all things, meant as a small gift, matters more than it might seem. Nothing about that discovery was earned through vigilance or suspicion. It arrived by chance, which means the truth had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone to bump into it, because neither of us had built a marriage where the truth got spoken on purpose. That's the real accumulation effect underneath everything. Not one decision, but hundreds of small unspoken ones, on both sides, compounding quietly until an ordinary act of love, trying to surprise my wife, was the thing that finally cracked it open. I don't know if Natalie and I could have survived this even with a different ending. What I know is that the version of me who existed before that phone call, the one who filed away a scarf, a lipstick, a phone turned face down, and called all of it nothing, had to disappear for either of us to have any honest future at all, together or apart. Losing that version of myself is, strangely, the part of this story I grieve least. I think about my father-in-law sometimes, Hector, a man who promised his daughter time he never got to give her, and I wonder if some part of what happened was Natalie trying to outrun a grief no affair could ever actually resolve. She's working on that now, with someone qualified to help her carry it. I hope she gets there. I hope, just as much, that I get somewhere honest myself. A place where the next time someone I love goes quiet, I don't mistake the quiet for peace. If there's one thing I'd want someone listening to this to sit with tonight, it's this. The quietest marriages aren't always the healthiest ones. Sometimes quiet is just two people too tired or too scared to ask each other the harder questions. I lived inside that kind of quiet for years and called it contentment. If you're sitting across from someone right now and something in your gut has gone still and cautious the way mine did with that scarf, that lipstick, that phone turned face down a half second too fast, I'd gently ask you to actually look at it instead of filing it away. Not out of paranoia, out of respect for the person across from you and for yourself. I don't regret the 13 years. I regret the version of myself who stopped showing up for the last two of them. And I've had to make peace with the fact that regret arrived slightly too late to save what it was mourning. If someone let you down, or you ignored a red flag you're only now willing to name, I'd genuinely like to know, in one word, in the comments. And to whoever made it this far with me tonight, thank you for sitting with something this heavy. It helped more than you probably know.